The music stopped. 20,000 people who had been on their feet screaming, singing along to Elvis's performance, suddenly fell silent as the king of rock and roll held up his hand to halt the band. Something was wrong in the audience. Elvis was squinting into the crowd, hand shielding his eyes from the spotlight, trying to see what was causing the disturbance 15 rows back. Security personnel were surrounding someone. There was shouting. A woman was crying. The band members looked at each other uncertainly. Was this a medical emergency? A fight? In all their years of performing with Elvis, they had rarely seen him stop a show mid-song unless something was seriously wrong. Elvis put the microphone to his lips, and his voice, usually smooth and confident, had an edge of concern that the entire arena could hear. "Hold on now, hold on. What's happening back there? Someone talk to me." A security guard, looking uncomfortable being suddenly in the spotlight, shouted back something about fire codes and safety regulations. Elvis's face changed, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't ask about regulations," he said, his voice carrying a tone that everyone in Madison Square Garden recognized as barely controlled anger. "I asked what's happening. Why is that woman crying?" The answer would reveal something about that family that would break Elvis's heart and inspire him to do something unprecedented in his career. If you want to discover how one 9-year-old deaf girl changed how the entire music industry thinks about accessibility, please subscribe to our channel. This story has never been told in full until now. Sarah Mitchell was 9 years old in June 1974, and she had been born profoundly deaf. Her parents, Linda and Robert Mitchell, had spent 9 years trying to help their daughter experience a world that wasn't designed for her. They had learned sign language as a family, had fought to get Sarah into schools that would educate rather than just warehouse deaf children, and had discovered through trial and error that Sarah experienced music differently than hearing people, but no less powerfully. When Sarah stood near speakers at home, she could feel the vibrations through her body. She would place her hands on the stereo and smile, swaying to rhythms she felt rather than heard. Her parents realized that for Sarah, music wasn't about ears at all. It was about feeling sound as a physical presence, about experiencing rhythm through vibration, about connecting to something universal in a way that was completely her own. When Linda saw the advertisement for Elvis Presley's concert at Madison Square Garden, something clicked in her mind. Elvis was known for his powerful stage presence, his dynamic performances, and most importantly, for sound systems that were incredibly loud and bass-heavy. If anywhere could give Sarah a real experience of live music, it would be an Elvis concert. Robert was skeptical about the cost. 3 tickets weren't cheap, and they were a working-class family from Queens who didn't have money to waste on experiments. But Linda was insistent. This wasn't about hearing Elvis sing. This was about giving their daughter a chance to feel what 20,000 other people would be experiencing that night, to be part of something huge and communal and joyful in a way that was rarely accessible to deaf children in 1974. They bought the tickets, row 15, as close as they could afford. But Linda had one more plan. She had read articles about deaf people experiencing music through vibrations, and she knew that the closer Sarah could get to the actual speakers, the more powerful the experience would be. She was determined to get her daughter as close to that stage as possible, even if it meant arguing with security, even if it meant causing a scene. What Linda didn't anticipate was just how much of a scene it would become, or that Elvis himself would notice. The concert started with explosive energy. Elvis emerged in a white jumpsuit studded with jewels that caught the lights and threw rainbow sparkles across the arena. The crowd was on its feet immediately, screaming, singing along, creating a wall of sound that was almost physical in its intensity. Sarah, sitting between her parents, couldn't hear any of it, but she could feel it. The vibrations came up through the floor, through her seat, and she was smiling, her hands pressed flat against the armrest to feel every pulse of bass. Her parents watched her face light up and knew they had made the right decision buying those tickets, even if this was all she got to experience. But Linda wanted more for her daughter. During the second song, she grabbed Robert's hand and gestured toward the stage. They were going to try to get Sarah closer. Robert hesitated, but Linda was already moving, holding Sarah's hand and navigating through the standing crowd toward the stage barrier. When they reached the security line, Linda leaned in and spoke to the guard, explaining their situation. The guard, Frank Morrison, listened and then shook his head. Fire codes, safety regulations, maximum capacity at the barrier already reached, no exceptions. Linda's voice rose. This wasn't about pushing to the front because they were fans. This was about accessibility, about giving a disabled child a chance to experience the concert. Frank sympathized, but he had a job to do. His supervisor was watching. The rules were the rules. The argument escalated. Linda was crying now, her voice breaking as she tried to make Frank understand what this meant to them, what it meant to Sarah. Robert joined in, his frustration evident. Other security guards moved in to help Frank manage the situation. People in the nearby rows were turning to watch, the disturbance pulling their attention away from the stage. And then Elvis stopped singing mid-phrase of Burning Love. The band faltered and went silent, and 20,000 people suddenly hushed to hear what was happening. Elvis didn't just stop the song. He walked to the very edge of the stage, getting as close to the commotion as he physically could. His voice, amplified through the massive sound system, carried authority and concern. When Frank tried to explain about regulations and fire codes, Elvis's response was immediate and sharp. "I didn't ask about regulations. I asked what's happening. Why is that woman crying?" The tone left no doubt that Elvis was not interested in hearing about policies. He wanted to know about people. Frank, trapped in the spotlight both literally and figuratively, tried to explain. A family wanted their daughter to stand closer to the speakers. The daughter was deaf. They thought she could feel the music through vibrations, but the barrier area was at capacity and safety protocols prohibited additional people in that space. As Frank spoke, Elvis's expression shifted from concern to something deeper. He looked directly at Linda, at Robert, at Sarah standing between them. The little girl was watching her parents' faces, following the conversation through their expressions and the movement of their lips, clearly aware that something important was happening, but not understanding what. Elvis turned to his band without using the microphone and said something brief. Then he turned back to the Mitchell family and spoke directly to them, his voice gentle but amplified so the entire arena could hear. "Is your little girl deaf?" Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. "And you want her to feel the music through the speakers?" Another nod. Elvis looked at Frank Morrison and the other security guards. "Then bring her up here." Frank started to protest, citing more regulations, but Elvis cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm not asking. Bring that family up here right now." The authority in his voice made it clear this wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was a command from the only person in that building who had the power to override every security protocol. What happened next would be talked about for decades. Security personnel helped the Mitchell family through the barrier and up the steps to the stage. Sarah, suddenly finding herself in front of 20,000 people with bright lights in her eyes, looked terrified. Elvis immediately knelt down to her level, making himself smaller and less intimidating. He looked at Linda and asked, "Can she read lips?" Linda nodded, her hand over her mouth in shock at where they were. Elvis turned to Sarah and spoke slowly and clearly, making sure she could see his face. "Hi, sweetheart. What's your name?" Sarah, coached by her parents to read lips carefully, understood the question and signed back her answer. Linda quickly interpreted. "She says her name is Sarah." Elvis smiled and asked Linda, "Can you teach me how to say, 'Nice to meet you' in sign language?" Linda, shaking, showed him the signs. Elvis copied them carefully, his large hands forming the gestures with surprising grace, and signed directly to Sarah. The little girl's eyes went wide with surprise and delight. Elvis Presley was signing to her. But Elvis wasn't done. He asked Sarah through Linda if she wanted to feel the music. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Elvis stood up and gestured to the massive speaker stacks on either side of the stage. He walked Sarah over to one of them, lifted her up easily, and placed her hands flat against the speaker grill. Then he turned to his band and gave them a nod. They launched into "Can't Help Falling in Love," one of Elvis's most beloved songs, and the speakers erupted with sound. Sarah's whole body registered the shock of it, vibrations traveling through her hands, up her arms, resonating in her chest. Her mouth opened in surprise and wonder, and then she started to cry, not from sadness but from overwhelming joy. Elvis kept one hand on Sarah's back, steadying her, while he sang directly to her. He wasn't performing for the 20,000 people in the arena anymore. He was performing for one 9-year-old deaf girl who was experiencing music, really experiencing it, for the first time in her life. The arena was silent except for Elvis's voice and the band. Every single person watching this moment unfold, many wiping tears from their own eyes. When the song ended, Elvis lifted Sarah down and asked her through Linda if she liked it. Sarah's response needed no translation. She threw her arms around Elvis's neck and hugged him with all the strength in her small body. Elvis could have left it there. He had already given Sarah and her family a moment they would never forget, had already demonstrated incredible kindness and accessibility awareness that was far ahead of its time. But, Elvis being Elvis, he took it further. He spoke to the crowd still holding Sarah's hand and explained what had just happened. He talked about how Sarah experiences music differently, but no less powerfully than anyone else in the arena. He said that music belongs to everyone, that it transcends hearing, that it's about feeling and connection and joy. His voice carried conviction as he said, "If we're not making music accessible to people like Sarah, then we're not doing our job as musicians." Then Elvis made an announcement that would echo through the music industry for years to come. He told his management team, standing in the wings, that from now on, every Elvis concert would have an accessible area for deaf and hard-of-hearing fans who wanted to experience music through vibrations. He instructed them to work with venues to create spaces where people could safely stand near speakers or feel bass through floors specifically designed to transmit vibrations. He committed to learning more sign language so he could communicate with deaf fans directly. And he pledged that a portion of his concert proceeds would go to organizations serving the deaf community. This wasn't a publicity stunt. This was Elvis using his enormous platform to advocate for accessibility in an era when disability rights were barely on anyone's radar. The crowd's response was thunderous, a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, people screaming their approval, many visibly emotional. But the response that mattered most was Sarah's. Elvis knelt down one more time, looked her in the eyes, and signed slowly and carefully something Linda had taught him during the song. "You are special." "Music loves you," Sarah signed back. "I love you." And Elvis understood without translation. He stood up, wiped his own eyes, and turned back to his band. "All right, let's give these people a show they'll never forget." The Mitchell family stayed for the rest of the concert, but now they were seated in the VIP section at the side of the stage, where Sarah could continue to feel the vibrations from the speakers. Every few songs, Elvis would look over at Sarah and sign to her, simple phrases that Linda had taught him during brief breaks. "Are you happy? Do you like this song? You're a good dancer." Sarah responded with enthusiasm, moving to the rhythms she felt, completely immersed in the experience. For Linda and Robert, watching their daughter experience pure joy, watching her be included in something that was usually inaccessible to her, was almost more than they could handle emotionally. After the show, Elvis's people brought the Mitchell family backstage. Elvis spent 30 minutes with them, asking through Linda about Sarah's education, about the challenges they faced as a family, about what resources existed for deaf children in New York. He was genuinely interested, genuinely concerned, and genuinely committed to doing something about it. Before they left, Elvis gave Sarah a signed photograph, but more importantly, he gave her parents his personal commitment that he would follow through on everything he had promised that night. He asked for their contact information and said his team would be in touch about the accessibility initiatives he had announced. Robert and Linda left Madison Square Garden that night barely believing what had happened, clutching the photograph, replaying every moment in their minds. True to his word, Elvis did follow through. Within months, venues hosting Elvis concerts were implementing accessibility sections for deaf patrons. Elvis's management team consulted with deaf advocacy organizations to understand best practices. Elvis himself continued learning sign language, hiring a tutor to help him communicate more effectively with deaf fans. By 1975, Elvis concerts featured sign language interpreters as well, providing access for deaf fans who wanted to follow the lyrics and Elvis's stage banter. Other major artists began following Elvis's lead, slowly but surely making the concert experience more inclusive. What started with one little girl on a stage in New York rippled outward, changing industry standards and expectations. For Sarah Mitchell, that night at Madison Square Garden was transformative. She had grown up in a world that often treated deafness as a limitation, that told her all the things she couldn't do, all the experiences she couldn't have. Elvis had shown her that limitations were often about accessibility rather than ability, that the world could adapt to include her rather than expecting her to simply accept exclusion. Her confidence blossomed. Her parents noticed a change in how she carried herself, how she advocated for herself at school, how she refused to accept unnecessary barriers. Sarah went on to graduate from Gallaudet University, the premier university for deaf and hard-of-hearing students. She became a music therapist, specifically working with deaf and hard-of-hearing children to help them experience music through vibration, movement, and visual representation. She spent her career expanding access to music for people who experienced it differently than hearing people, directly inspired by what Elvis had done for her that night in 1974. She married, had children of her own, and made sure they understood that their mother's career and life philosophy had been shaped by 3 minutes on stage with Elvis Presley. Sarah kept that signed photograph from Elvis in her office throughout her career. She would show it to the children she worked with, telling them the story of the night a famous musician stopped his concert to make sure one deaf girl could feel the music. She used it to teach them that they deserved access, deserved inclusion, deserved to experience joy in whatever way worked for them. The photograph became more than just a memento. It became a teaching tool, a symbol of what was possible when people chose inclusion over exclusion, when they prioritized people over policies. The story of Elvis and Sarah Mitchell became part of disability rights history, cited in academic papers and advocacy campaigns as an early example of accessibility awareness in mainstream entertainment. In 1974, disability rights activism was still in its early stages. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 had just been passed, including Section 504, which prohibited discrimination based on disability. But enforcement was weak, and cultural attitudes were slow to change. The Americans with Disabilities Act wouldn't be passed until 1990, 16 years after Elvis stopped his concert for Sarah. But moments like what happened at Madison Square Garden helped shift cultural consciousness, helped people understand that accessibility wasn't about special treatment, but about basic inclusion. Elvis's commitment to accessibility at his concerts influenced other artists and venues. By the late 1970s, major concert venues in several cities had created designated areas for deaf and hard-of-hearing patrons who wanted to experience music through vibrations. Sign language interpretation at concerts became more common, though still far from universal. The concert industry began, slowly and imperfectly, to think about accessibility in ways it hadn't before. Elvis didn't single-handedly create accessible concerts, but he used his platform and influence to accelerate change that was desperately needed. What's particularly remarkable about Elvis's actions that night is that he didn't approach accessibility as charity or as a public relations move. He approached it as a matter of basic fairness and human dignity. His response wasn't, "Let me do something nice for this disabled child." It was, "Why are we excluding people from experiencing music?" He questioned the systems and policies that created barriers rather than placing the burden on disabled people to adapt to an inaccessible world. That shift in perspective, that refusal to accept exclusion as normal or necessary, was radical for 1974, and frankly remains radical in many ways today. 50 years after Elvis lifted Sarah Mitchell onto that stage and placed her hands on those speakers, accessibility in entertainment has improved but remains far from universal. Many venues now offer accommodations for deaf and hard-of-hearing patrons. Many concerts feature sign language interpreters, and vibration-based music experiences for deaf people have become more sophisticated and widespread. But barriers still exist. The fight for true accessibility is ongoing, requiring constant advocacy and pressure to prevent backsliding and to push for continued progress. The story of Elvis and Sarah reminds us that change often starts with individual acts of courage and compassion. Elvis could have ignored the disturbance in his audience, could have let security handle it according to policy, could have prioritized the smooth continuation of his show over the needs of one family. Instead, he stopped everything, he asked questions, he listened, and he acted. He used his power and platform not just to help one little girl experience his concert, but to advocate for systemic change that would benefit countless others. That's the difference between charity and justice, between a kind gesture and a commitment to accessibility. For anyone watching that concert or hearing about it afterward, the message was clear. Disabled people deserve access, deserve inclusion, deserve to experience joy in whatever way works for them. Elvis taught 20,000 people that night that music belongs to everyone, that accessibility is not a burden, but an opportunity, that making space for people who experience the world differently enriches everyone's experience. Those lessons remain as relevant today as they were in 1974, perhaps more so, as we continue to grapple with questions of inclusion, accessibility, and what we owe to each other as members of a shared society. Elvis Presley made a lot of music in his life. He had countless hit records, starred in numerous films, and performed for millions of people around the world. But on June 14, 1974, he did something more important than entertain. He saw a wrong, he stopped everything to make it right, and he committed himself to ensuring that wrong wouldn't continue. That's the measure of a person's character, not what they do when cameras are rolling and publicists are planning, but what they do when confronted with injustice in real time, when they have the power to choose inclusion or exclusion, fairness or policy. Elvis chose right, and a 9-year-old deaf girl named Sarah Mitchell, along with countless others who benefited from the accessibility changes Elvis championed, never forgot it.